I call the Honourable Member Carol Beaumont.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to stand and speak on the Victims of Crime Reform Bill for the first reading. Labor is supporting this bill, as others will have said, to Select Committee. And the purpose of this bill, I think, is worth just outlining again, because I think it's always important at the first reading to understand what we're dealing with. The objectives of the bill are to strengthen the existing general provisions in legislation for victims of crime, to expand the rights of victims of serious offences, and to give victims more opportunity to be involved in criminal justice processes by ensuring they're better informed about their rights and increasing the accountability and responsiveness of government agencies providing services to victims, and ensuring that victims' rights in the adult criminal justice jurisdiction are applied in the youth justice jurisdiction. Now, we'll probably go through some of those in a little bit more detail, but this is an omnibus bill, and it amends 4 different acts: the Victims' Right Act 2002, Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act 1989, Parole Act 2002 and the Sentencing Act 2002. And certainly Labor agrees that victims do need to have a greater role in criminal justice process, because there is a lack of a visible complaints process and oversight of victims' rights. And I think that the debate of recent times has come round to a recognition that our justice system does serve, obviously, the interests of us as a society in ensuring that the rules that we all agree are in place and are enforced, that those who break those rules will have some consequence of doing that, but that the processes around that will be fair and just, but also that those who have, if you like, been hurt by crime should also be part of that equation. So we certainly agree with that and the need to look closely at this, and it was under the Labor government, Justice and Electoral Select Committee conducted an inquiry into victims' rights in 2007, which highlighted some of the issues that have finally been addressed in this bill. So to that extent, this is a logical next step. Now, it's interesting speaking about this bill, having spoke earlier today on the criminal processes modernisation bill, because alongside all of these types of initiatives, there is very important questions of balance and very important questions about ensuring that justice is in fact served. And we have a system and it's set up in a particular way, and we need to make sure that in trying to look at one group, that we don't severely disadvantage or undermine those fundamental principles that we have in our justice system. And so the Law Society has expressed reservations about some of the initiatives presented by the government, particularly the expanding role of victims in the courtroom, which might move the courts away from the dispassionate dispensing of justice. And certainly I think we will all on Select Committee, and I'm assuming, I don't know, sorry, if it is coming to Justice and Electoral, but whichever Select Committee it will be at, I'm sure that all of the members will pay close attention to submissions in the Select Committee to ensure that both victims' rights and the rights of the accused are balanced to achieve appropriate and fair outcomes. And I think that's really important, that sense of balance. So despite the Law Society's reservations that I've just mentioned, they do support moves in the legislation to give adult victims the right to read their statements in court. But the question of whether children, subjecting children to further court processes might not be a particularly positive advancement of children's rights is a live question, I think. And again, certainly I think with the Select Committee there will need to be close attention paid to what is best for children in this whole process. The Ministry of Justice, in the regulatory impact statement, the Ministry of Justice have identified 3 broad concerns facing victims of crime, and that is that victims find it frustrating dealing with multiple government agencies to get information about the criminal justice system, their rights and services, and that seems to me to be something that should be readily able to be fixed. It seems a very sensible suggestion to start to make that access to information much more streamlined and effective for those victims, because after all, victims of crime, especially victims of violent crimes, domestic violence, sexual violence and the like, are already traumatised by those crimes, and we need to make sure that the agencies that they deal with make the process as smooth and as supportive as possible for them. So that was one of the three broad concerns of the Ministry of Justice. The second one is the mechanisms for making criminal justice agencies accountable for the information they provide or services they deliver to victims being very weak. So that sense of getting greater accountability and ensuring that victims do get good service from those agencies. And again, I make the point that many victims are already traumatised by the crime that they've experienced, and it seems to me to be a reasonable proposition that there should be some accountability, that agencies dealing with them are doing that in a manner that doesn't further victimise those victims or doesn't make the trauma that they've already dealing with worse. The third area that the Ministry has identified in the regulatory impact statement are that many victims find the current criminal justice processes bewildering and feel that they do not have any role in the criminal case involving them. And again, if somebody has been traumatised or has been really undermined by a crime that's been committed against them, what you don't want is a court process that just reinforces that, a process that further makes them feel like they are being undermined and that their confidence and self-esteem is lessened. So I can see that those three broad concerns are certainly relevant. I know for a fact that many women who have been victims of violent crime often find those things to be so, and that dealing with those areas seems to me to be very, very important. So in the main provisions of the bill, first of all, in the Victims' Right Act, some of the provisions include a definition of victim, and then questions around the duty to inform victims. This is this question about the agencies that provide information. Information about proceedings must be given to the victim, and I think this is a really good point. This is making sure that in dealing with the criminal justice system, the victim of the crime is clear what will be happening, what their role in it, what they will be expected to do, all of those sorts of things, so that they know what's going to happen in advance. It also goes on to look at information and victim impact statements, and it provides that information ascertained from a victim in a victim impact statement may include photographs, drawings or other visual representations. So that's pretty important. Mr. Speaker, there are also talks in Part 2 about a code for victims, and that will require the preparation of a code for victims for the purpose of providing information about their statutory rights, services available to them and duties and responsibilities of government agencies. And in preparing that code, the Secretary preparing it must undertake consultation. The code must be then approved and signed by the Minister of Justice before it takes effect. Secretary of Justice must publish that notice of the Minister's approval of the code in the Gazette. So that sounds like a very sensible suggestion. So that's in terms of changes to the Victims' Rights Act. There are then also changes to the Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act 1989, and that bill redefines the term victim to align it with the definition in the Victims' Rights Act. It also requires the prosecutor to make reasonable efforts to ascertain and convey to a youth court the views of victims of specified offences before an order is made releasing or detaining. And there's also changes in that Act around the custody of a child or young person pending hearing. So those are the areas that are covered in that particular Act. In the Parole Act, the main change there is around Section 4 to update the definition again, the definition of a victim, and what information may be available. So it really is aligning those acts. In the Sentencing Act, 2002, restorative justice, and the bill requires a district court in certain cases to adjourn the proceedings at any time before sentencing to enable inquiries to be made to determine whether a restorative justice process is appropriate in the circumstances. So those are the main changes in those acts, Mr. Speaker.
I acknowledge the honourable member